Hello, High Rock. I'm John, one of the pastors here, and I am so glad to be with you today to complete our tour of the 7 cities of Revelation, where we pull back the curtain to see what Jesus has to say to them and to us. So far, we've had a peek at churches that thought they could love God without loving one another. We've looked in on some churches that were allowing false teachings to creep into the church, including teachings that justified flagrant immorality. Rather than impacting the culture around them, they were being assimilated into it. And we've also peered in at churches that were pursuing wealth and success more than they were pursuing faithfulness to God. But we've also seen some churches that were praised for how well they were doing, especially under tremendous persecution. That seems to just about cover it, right? What else could be going on that would be important enough to write about? Well, there is one more church to consider, the final church on this road trip, the church in Laodicea. Jesus had already addressed the lure of wealth and worldly success, the temptation to just fit in with the culture around us, and the dangers of allowing tribal divisions to creep into the church. What other problems could there possibly be? What is wrong with Laodicea? Well, in a word, complacency. An apathy that arises when we are just too comfortable to be bothered about anyone else. In particular, complacency that arises from prosperity. Which is worse, ignorance or apathy? I don't know, and I don't care. That's complacency. I don't see the problem. I don't want to see the problem, and I wouldn't care even if I did. Ignorance plus apathy. That's complacency. And it's not just an ancient problem, it's alive and well today. If you're a parent or a manager or leader or teacher, you have no doubt been frustrated by the complacency of those under your care. It's one thing when people have been working hard or are stressed out and they need a break. That is a good thing. But what about when the only thing people want is to lollygag or dawdle or lounge around without a care, when there is so much that needs caring about? Back when I was a kid, in the long, long ago, we didn't have memes. What we had were t-shirts and bumper stickers, like "Keep on Truckin'," which was popular because of a song called "Convoy" that even was made into a movie. Then there was "Just Passing Through," which I think was a reference to a song or a band, I'm not sure. Apparently there was a Christian version of this because, of course, there was. I bring all of this up because there was a very popular slogan that made it onto a t-shirt: "I'm number one, why try harder?" That's a kind of complacency, right? Complacency mixed with arrogance, but still complacency. But if complacency is the goal, then why bother being number one? Well, sure enough, an even more popular t-shirt came out. Instead of "I'm number one, why try harder?" it said, "I'm number 3. I don't try at all." And I think that t-shirt slogan sums up Laodicea. We're number 3. We don't try at all. Laodicea was wealthy. So wealthy that the Roman senator Cicero mentioned the banks in Laodicea as a great place to exchange currency. But they were not as wealthy as Ephesus or maybe even Sardis. Ephesus could wear the "I'm number 1" shirt, while Laodicea could rest comfortably with "I'm number 3, I don't try at all." And like Sardis that Pastor Dave spoke about with their groundbreaking color textile industry, Laodicea also had a thriving textile and clothing industry. They were renowned for their black rugs, crafted from the black wool of their bountiful flocks of sheep. But their clothing industry was not the leader that Sardis was with their revolutionary dyeing and colored cloth. Still, Laodicea was doing quite all right. No worries on their end. Laodicea also had a rare treasure for the ancient world, a medical school, and they produced medicines for export. More on that later. All in all, they were doing quite well. Not well enough to be number 1, but well enough to live happy, comfortable lives. I'm number 3. Why try at all? Complacency. But the risen Jesus has a different assessment of their condition. Listen to what he says. You say, I am rich, I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. And you don't realize that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. You think you have everything, but you are too willfully ignorant to realize that you have nothing. Ignorance plus apathy. That's complacency. And though this message would have been hard to hear, it is not a condemnation. It is a diagnosis of their true condition. It's like when my friend thought he was doing fine, just a little under the weather. Then a subsequent doctor's visit revealed that he had serious heart disease and needed a triple bypass. That diagnosis of heart disease was not a condemnation. The physician was there to heal, not to hurt. And Jesus is the great healer who expertly diagnoses the heart condition of the Laodicean church. In their complacency, they thought they had everything. But in truth, they had nothing. In an apparent effort to wake them out of their ignorance and apathy, Jesus has other hard words for them. He initially addresses them with a metaphor that would have resonated deeply with them. Jesus said, I know all the things you do. In your ignorance, you might not know, but I do know that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were one or the other. But since you are like lukewarm water, neither hot or cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. This verse is famous. Even people who have never read the Bible have often heard it, but it's also often misunderstood. For many years, centuries even, people heard these words as saying, I wish you were hot, that you were on fire with your faith. And if not that, I wish you were cold, like hardened atheists or unbelievers who are dead set against me. Pick a side. But because you're neither hot or cold, instead you're lukewarm. In other words, God hates neutrality. God hates lukewarm Christianity. God would rather have you be an enemy than some lukewarm Christian. And in some ways, that message has some overlap with the truth, but it also missed the mark in some very important ways. And the reason is context. Without knowing the context of Laodicea, people, even scholars, were reading our context into the passage. In our context, being hot or cold about something often means that you are for or against something. Hot means you're for it, cold means you're against it. So it was natural to read this passage as saying that you should be for or against God, just don't try to be neutral. And it was a message that played well with evangelists and pastors as an altar call. No middle ground. Choose this day. Will you be hot or cold about Jesus? Better to be against Jesus than lukewarm. So if you don't want to be against God, you'd better make the decision right now to be on fire for God. But that's not what hot or cold meant in Laodicea in the first century. If you were in Laodicea, hot and cold water meant something very specific. A few miles to the north, just outside the city of Hierapolis, there were, and still are, incredible hot springs that erupt from the earth with all kinds of minerals and salts. These springs were regarded as a place of incredible and even miraculous healing. Unlike Hierapolis, Laodicea did not have hot springs. They had heard about it, and anyone who had traveled anywhere would have seen these waters and even bathed in them. Even if you're not seeking a cure for some disease, you can just imagine the luxury of bathing in a hot spring. It's a huge tourist spot even to this day. If you headed in the opposite direction of Hierapolis, about 10 miles to the southeast, there was a city of Colossae, the recipient of Paul's letter to the Colossians. Colossae was on the Lycus River, just like Laodicea, but their water situation was very different from Laodicea. The Lycus River had a habit of drying up in the summer, just when you needed water the most. But Colossae had a backup. Actually, it had a better option altogether. There were natural cold springs that supplied Colossae with almost endless streams of crystal clear, cold, drinkable water. So Colossae was safe even when the Lycus River dried up. But what about Laodicea? Well, they built aqueducts to move that water all the way from Colossae to Laodicea. That's a distance of about 10 miles. And even though the water started out crystal clear and cold at Colossae, by the time it reached Laodicea, it would no longer be clear and no longer be cold. It would be lukewarm. That's what the Laodiceans would have heard in Jesus' words. I wish that you were hot, like the hot springs of Hierapolis, water that heals, water that rejuvenates. I wish that you were cold, like the cool springs of Colossae, water that refreshes you on a hot day, water that gives life. Instead, you're lukewarm. You're like the muddy, silty, piped-in slurry that you all complain about and makes you sick. And what do you do with such lukewarm, silty water? You spit it out. It's disgusting. In our discussion question today, we talked about something that others might be surprised to know that you find unappealing or even disgusting. If the Laodiceans had been here today, they would have answered, the water. It's terrible. You can barely drink it. Hot water, wonderful. It will heal you. Cold water, how refreshing. But lukewarm water that comes from leaky, mineralized pipes? Gross. That's the situation in Laodicea. They were ignorant of their real spiritual condition. They were apathetic about the danger they were in. They were complacent. And that complacency is revolting, just like the water. When I was a pastor at a previous church, we were looking for a place to meet, and there was this dying church that was in an ideal location. It was right next to a public space where teens and young adults would regularly gather, especially when there was nothing else to do. I thought it would be great to open up a coffee house on Friday or Saturday nights and invite them in for live music or poetry and story open mic nights or board games, or even just to hang out somewhere warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It was also easily walkable for several neighborhoods that were multifamily houses and young families. During some of our town days, I met several of the leaders from their church. These were elderly folks who were excited that there was a church in town like ours that was impacting the younger folks. Maybe our church and their church could do something together. It seemed like a match made in heaven. But their pastor didn't think so. Financially, they didn't need to reach anybody. Deceased members of their church had left a financial endowment as well as some prime property that was being rented to local businesses. This financial security meant that they could continue to operate just fine until the pastor retired, which is exactly what happened. And then they closed. Rather than change their approach to ministry, rather than seek a path to life, they instead defined their mission as serving the local senior community. That's what they were already doing by default, so that became their mission. It's like shooting an arrow at the side of a barn, and wherever that arrow lands, you draw a target around it and declare, bullseye. As I see it, it was a kind of complacency that was sustained by their prosperity. But it's not just something I see in church leadership. Complacency, being lukewarm about the mission of Jesus, is a temptation we all face. There's a famous saying in church circles that says, us for and no more. I don't know where it started, but it refers to the commonly experienced dynamic where a circle of friends transforms into a clique. It's a circle of people who find company with one another and decide that what they have is special. And part of keeping it special means excluding anyone else. That's what a clique is. It's a circle of friends that decides that no one else is welcome. It happens with small groups. It happens with prayer groups. It happens with spiritual friends who gather for coffee. It is a temptation for us all. But when we find something good and decide to protect that good thing by closing the doors for others, what then? How are we any different than the Laodiceans who say, I'm good. I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. All the while remaining unconcerned for anyone else, such as their next door neighbors who are suffering in Philadelphia, or just a few miles beyond that, their Christian brothers and sisters being imprisoned in Smyrna. Isn't it ignorance to not realize that there are people who are desperate to taste the spiritual blessings that we are hoarding for ourselves? Isn't it apathy when we choose not to care even when we do realize the truth? Ignorance and apathy. The same complacency that Jesus was addressing in Laodicea. I'm happy. I've got mine. So just keep on trucking. My life dream used to be one of complacency. I remember reading about a pair of lawyers who established a practice in which they each worked 7 months a year. So they had an overlap to transition their cases. So they each had 5 months off to explore whatever adventures they could dream up. That became my dream. Almost immediately, I took the law school aptitude test, aced it. Step 1, done. Step 2, I signed up for the debate team and became a national champion that year. I love it when a plan comes together. But at the JV national tournament at George Mason University, I badgered and bullied an opponent so badly in cross-examination that they started crying. We won that round, and my debate partner thought it was awesome. But I wasn't so sure. In fact, that moment began to haunt me. Debate was just a game, but could I look myself in the mirror if I did that to someone else in real life, with real stakes? Don't get me wrong. People love to make fun of lawyers until they need one. Lawyers can do incredible good. But I began to realize that I was in it only for the eventual payoff of being complacent full time, or at least 5 months out of the year. I wasn't thinking of Jesus' words to the Christians in Laodicea at the time, but I think the second half of verse 17 sums up how I was beginning to feel at that moment. The first half says, I am rich. I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. That was the plan, to be rich, to be able to relax and enjoy it all and say, I don't need a thing. I have everything I want. But I was starting to realize the bankruptcy of that plan, which comes out in the second half of the verse. And you don't realize that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. I wasn't fully there yet, but I was starting to feel it. Complacency that comes from prosperity. I had made it my literal life goal, but the Spirit was starting to penetrate my conscience and show me the miserable bankruptcy of my dreams. And it all started with that debate at George Mason. Again, Jesus' diagnosis of their situation, Jesus' diagnosis of my situation or your situation, it is not meant to condemn. It's a diagnosis from the great healer, a diagnosis that is meant to lead to healing. And that's the very next thing Jesus speaks about, their healing. And he makes it deeply contextual to their situation. First, Jesus says, so I advise you to buy gold from me, gold that has been purified by fire. Then you will be rich. Remember, the great Roman orator and senator Cicero commented about exchanging money at the banks of Laodicea. Jesus uses that very point of pride and flips it around. Yes, your banks are so good at exchanging currencies. Let's do that. Use your earthly gold to buy eternal gold from me, from Jesus. If your treasure is here, it will rust and rot, but treasure in heaven will last forever. Even more to the point, at the end of his parable about the shrewd manager, Jesus says this, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Money won't last, but relationships may. Not just us four and no more, but many more than that, hopefully. Complacency is poverty. Generosity is real wealth. After addressing their wealth and their banks, Jesus uses the image of their wool industry and their medical school with all their medicines. He says, also buy white garments from me, so you will not be shamed by your nakedness, and ointment for your eyes, so you will be able to see. Right now, as complacent as you are, your shame is so deep that you might as well be naked, but Jesus will clothe you in white. Right now, complacent as you are blind, but Jesus will open your eyes to see if you let him. Jesus is offering them healing, not condemnation. I correct and discipline everyone I love, so be diligent and turn from your indifference. Turn from your complacency. Stop caring only about yourselves and those closest to you, not us four and no more, but us four and many more. This life is not meant to be about comfort and security. A safe life like that is an impoverished life. Don't believe me, believe Jesus. In essence, their lukewarm love, their lukewarm faithfulness, their lukewarm lives were like the lukewarm water that they all wanted to spit out. It was revolting, even if they couldn't see it. By excluding others from their concerns, they had inadvertently excluded Jesus himself. Remember, in one of his most famous parables, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." And that's why Jesus approaches the Laodiceans as if he was an outsider, one of those people who had been excluded from the blessings of fellowship. "Look, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in, and we will share a meal together as friends." Jesus, approaching the church as if he was an outsider, a stranger. That's what complacency can do. It cuts us off from Jesus because by rejecting the needs of others, we have rejected Jesus. By not even thinking about or planning for the needs of others, we have left Jesus on the outside. But Jesus is willing to be the one to restore fellowship. Even if we have kicked him out, he is ready and eager to enter again. If we hear the knock, that's the knock that awakens us out of our ignorance. And if we open the door, that's taking a step out of our apathy. Then Jesus will enter in and welcome us again as friends. You know, I often make a big point about how English doesn't have a second person plural pronoun. You know, when someone says you don't know if they are speaking to you as an individual or you as in a whole group of people. I guess you could say y'all or yous guys. In Greek, you can tell the difference between a singular and a plural pronoun. And I like to make the point that the Bible is often saying you as in y'all. And we mistakenly read those words as if the Bible is speaking to us as individuals. However, today, it's the opposite. In fact, it is the one time in any of the letters to the 7 churches where Jesus speaks to each one of us as individuals. Jesus says, if you, that's you, the individual you, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and we will share a meal together as friends. Jesus is speaking to you. Not just the church as a whole or y'all or yous guys. Jesus is speaking to each and every one of you. It doesn't matter if everyone else is apathetic and ignorant. It doesn't matter if everyone else settles into complacency. If you, yes, you, hear Jesus' voice today and welcome him in, he will enter into your life and grant you spiritual riches, clothing to cover your shame, and ointment to open your eyes to the wonders that God has in store. And what's more, Jesus will welcome you into his home, which is actually a palace. Remember, he's the Lord of all creation. You will be welcomed into Jesus' home to share his very throne. I believe that no one here wants complacency. No one grows up thinking that they want to claw their way up to middle management. In my life, I didn't want complacency, even when I had literally made it my life's dream. Jesus knew that there was something deeper in my heart that would starve to death in a complacent life. Rather than freedom, it would become a prison. And I believe the same about all of us here today. The whole reason you're here today is because something deep in your bones longs for more. There has to be more. And Jesus assures you there is. But we need to seek true riches, which are ultimately relationships with Jesus and with one another. We need to allow Jesus to clothe us and cover our shame with his grace and calling, his divine commission to not just stay where we are, but to go out into a lost and hurting world and share the good news about Jesus. And we need the great healer to treat our blindness, to open our eyes to what the good life actually is. Not a life with comfort and security stored up for ourselves, but a life poured out in love. A life that follows the path that Jesus walked. The path that Jesus offers today is clear. We need to listen for Jesus' voice. We need to hear his invitation, his knock at the door, and we need to let him into our lives. Do you hear Jesus knocking? Are you listening, truly listening for his voice? When I get home tonight, Harley, our dog, will immediately perk up and run to the door to greet me. What a lesson we could learn from our pets about being eager to welcome Jesus home. Where might God be desiring to enter into your life? Where have you excluded God or so filled your life with your own pursuits that you have no spare headroom to even consider Jesus? And remember, Jesus invites us to see his face in those we are tempted to see as the least of these. That, I believe, is the invitation present in this final letter to the churches of Revelation. In fact, let's take this moment to close our eyes, quiet ourselves, take a deep breath, and attend to whether Jesus might be knocking on your door, even right now. Jesus is knocking. He wants you. He wants you to open the door and invite him in. Will you today, this week? Let's eagerly listen for Jesus and invite him in. Amen.